You a CEO looking to scale your company faster and easier? Check out Thrive Roundtable. Thrive combines a moderated peer group mastermind, expert one-on-one coaching, access to proven growth tools, and a 24/7 support community. Created by Inc. award-winning CEO and certified scaling-up business coach Bruce Eckfeldt, Thrive will help you grow your business more quickly and with less drama. For details on the program, visit eckfeldt.com/thrive. That's eckfeldt.com/thrive.
Hey everyone, Bruce Eckfeldt here. Thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Make sure that you subscribe and turn on notifications so we can let you know when the next video is posted. You can also check us out at eckfeldt.com for more great content. With that, let's go check out the video.
You're listening to Thinking Outside the Bud, where we speak with entrepreneurs, investors, thought leaders, researchers, advocates, and policymakers who are finding new and exciting ways for cannabis to positively impact business, society, and culture. And now, here is your host, business coach, Bruce Eckfeldt.
Welcome everyone, this is Thinking Outside the Bud. I'm Bruce Eckfeldt, I'm your host. Today we're here with Andy Joseph, and Andy is founder and president of Apex Supercritical, which is a CO2 extraction system based in Johnstown, Ohio. We're going to talk to him a little bit about the extraction process, the technology, his professional background. Andy, welcome to the program.
Thanks, Bruce. Appreciate having me on the show, and happy to be here.
Yeah, it's always a pleasure. So I always like to start with just kind of getting people's professional background. I was curious how people got into the cannabis space. So why don't you give people a sense of professionally what you were doing and then kind of how you got into cannabis, and then we can talk a little bit about the company and what you're focused on with Supercritical.
I guess my career started in the Navy. Graduated high school and did 6 years nuclear submarines out of Pearl Harbor. Was a nuclear mechanic, essentially, where I worked on the mechanical portions of the nuclear power plant and the propulsion systems on the submarine. After I was in the Navy and got out, I started my engineering career at Ohio State University, where I got my master's and bachelor's degrees in welding engineering. While I was doing that, I started a fabrication business. You know, the Navy gives you an opportunity to pay for school, but they don't necessarily pay for all of it. And so I decided to, I needed to make a few extra bucks. And, I started a fabrication business. Actually met a customer who needed some botanical oil extraction equipment made. He had a small glassware line and needed some metal devices made for larger capacity. So I started working with that customer and things progressed along. Graduated and took a corporate job as an engineer and then quickly moved into management and found myself as management where I wasn't getting my hands dirty anymore. And I like to get my hands dirty and that kind of stuff. So I missed it. So I kept doing Apex on the side, and Apex was a side job for me all the way from about 2001 until 2012. And during that entire time, I worked with this customer, kind of designing and building different types of extraction systems, most of them CO2, but also some ethanol and alcohol extraction systems as well. 2012 came along, and I had 2 full-time jobs. Right, I'm in a position where I got to make a choice. It's tough. I'm working corporate, going to my quote-unquote day job, and then at the same time, I got to go home and on weekends and evenings build these and design these extraction systems. So 2012, was kind of the point where I said, I got to make a choice. I have to do one or the other. And so I made the leap. Cannabis had found us in 2008, 2009. It started to really pick up, and cannabis found CO2 extraction as a great alternative to the butanes and propanes that were being utilized at the time and causing, explosions and dirty extractions. And it was a great option for, a need, and the two found each other.
So the work you were doing in botanical extractions were not cannabis up until then?
That's right. They were flavorings, food products, essential oil extractions, things like that. So, once the cannabis industry kind of started to take hold of the CO2 extraction technology, then the equipment that we were designing and manufacturing started to take off. By 2012, like I said, I had 2 full-time jobs. So I quit my real job and decided to focus on Apex full-time. And unfortunately, the relationship that I had built up over the last 11 or 12 years kind of fizzled out very quickly. We did everything wrong from an entrepreneurial standpoint. So you're talking about learning entrepreneur stuff, learning lessons. We did everything wrong. We didn't have a single piece of paper between us. Even though we'd worked for 10 or 11 years, done a couple $1 million in business together, we never had a single piece of paper. And once it got to the point where I wanted to focus on it full-time, we had some disagreements on ownership, disagreements on intellectual property, disagreements on technology direction. So we decided to, go our separate ways, and we're still competitors today, actually.
Yeah.
But, from 2012 standpoint, here I am. I quit my full-time job, focusing on Apex. I got 4 kids, another one on the way. And all of a sudden I lose my only customer.
Yeah.
Right. And so I had to build up Apex almost from scratch. Essentially, I had a product, had a design, had a manufacturing capability, but I didn't have a website. I didn't have branding. I didn't have a logo. I had nothing. So I had to really start from scratch. And Google AdWords was my friend at that point.
Oh, interesting.
So yeah, it really worked out well. And Apex, you struggled a little bit before we got on the call here with pronouncing Apex. We spell it differently, and I'd love to say it was intentional. We spell it differently because there were too many APEXs out there already. So we were uncreative and said, all right, let's just spell it different.
Different letter. Yeah.
Yeah. Back in 2001, starting with an A made sense because it puts you in the front of the phone book.
Yeah.
Here in 2018, spelling your name differently puts you in a higher ranking profile on Google AdWords and Google searches. Yeah. So, I'd love to say I was had all kinds of forethought and knew that was going to happen. But
I'd rather be lucky.
Yeah, right. Exactly. That's what happens. I was lucky. But anyway, so since 2012 until today, Apex Supercritical has been building it and delivering CO2 extraction systems primarily to the cannabis space. 95% roughly of our systems go towards cannabis operators throughout the country as well as international.
Yeah.
And in October of last year, we actually shipped our 500th CO2 extractor.
Wow.
So we're proud of that.
Maybe give people a sense of, let's just talk about extraction a little bit, because I think some people kind of vaguely know what this is, but let's kind of define what the extraction process kind of entails from a mechanical, technical point of view, and then what the different extraction processes are or technologies are, and then why CO2 potentially over the butane and some of these other ones. So let's talk about extraction. When we talk about extraction, what is essentially involved? Like, what are we trying to do in the extraction process?
So basically, another word for extraction would be concentration. So one way to think of it is we're essentially removing the plant material from the oil or waxes or fats or whatever, but basically the oil that is contained within the plant that has the cannabinoids in it, right? So all your THC, all your CBD, all your CBG, all your CBN, all the cannabinoids are contained generally within these oily fats and waxes that are inside the plant. Most of them are concentrated in the trichomes of the plant material, but some are within the plants and the leaves and the stems and that kind of stuff, and lowering concentrations. Essentially, all extraction is separating those oils, fats, waxes with the cannabinoids in them from the botanical plant material or the organic material itself. Another way to look at it is concentrating. So by removing the plant material, you're increasing the percentage of cannabinoids over the total amount of material that they're contained within. So you're increasing the concentration.
And so you're basically taking raw plant material. Describe the process a little bit. So you're pre-processing that at some level so that you can make it extractable. And then how does the actual process work in terms of getting the oils or removing the plant material, getting the oil out, depending on how you want to look at it?
Yeah, it's complex. Realize there's not just a black and white, one process does all kind of thing. As you can imagine, there's several different variations. Yeah. But generally, the extraction process starts with a pre-processing step, like you said. You're going to want to dry and grind the material. There are other extraction processes, particularly a method called live resin that uses wet material, basically material that's been harvested directly and just shoved right into the extractor. But we talk about most extraction processes, even if CO2, butane, propane, most of them will start with dried or cured plant material. They'll grind it to get a smaller particle size so that one, you can get more material into the vessel, but also increase your surface area. Exactly. Those pre-processing steps can also include decarboxylation. So some people will choose to decarboxylate or essentially convert the acid form THCA into THC prior to extraction. CO2 in particular, it's beneficial to decarboxylate because it's going to give you faster extractions as opposed to decarboxylating on the other side after the extraction. But once you've got your material pre-processed, dried, ground, and potentially even decarboxylated, you'll put it into an extraction system. It can be CO2, it could be butane, it could be protein, it could be hexane, pentane, could be ethanol. There's lots of different extraction technologies, but they all fundamentally do the same thing, and that is separate the botanical oils from the plant material that's there. Once the extraction done, a lot of people will refer to this step as the crude extraction. A corollary would be oil and gas, like gasoline. You extract crude oil out of the ground, and then you refine it into different grades of propane and gasoline and gear oil and lubrications and whatever it might be. Similar thing happens here. Once the extraction done, the crude extraction is done, you can do several different types of refining steps that allow you to then create the different product types that most people are familiar with in dispensaries, whether it be shatter, crumble, honeycomb for dabbing applications, vape pen oil. A whether sometimes it's just wholesale oil that subsequently gets winterized and then utilized for distillation. Winterization is just a process to separate the fats and waxes from the oils that the cannabinoids are in. Distillation is a tertiary or third step refining process. The question a lot of people usually have at this stage is, well, so what? Why do I do these different things? And generally, it's concentration level.
Okay.
Right? So, when we talk concentration, not yield, this isn't how much oil I got out of the plant material. Okay. This is concentration. If you look at most extractions, most people are going to extract trim. Right? Okay. We're trending towards more flower extractions, but for the most part, people extract trim because trim otherwise is useless.
Yeah, exactly.
It's got value in it. Yeah. And so rather than throwing it away, because it does still have cannabinoids in it, lower concentration levels, typically 10, maybe 15% cannabinoid level, maybe even down to 5 or 6%, depending on the quality of the trim. But whether it's 5 to 15% is your range for your starting plant material, the bulk extraction or the crude extraction step generally increases that concentration level to 40, maybe 50%.
Okay.
Now, your crude oil is sitting there at 40 to 50%. If you winterize it, that's going to take you up to probably 60, maybe 70%.
Okay. That's because you're taking off some of the waxes and fats.
Exactly. Leaving behind the cannabinoids, you're further concentrating. Yeah. And then if you go to a next step, which a lot of people refer to as distillation, that can be short path distillation, white film distillation, thin film distillation. There's several different ways to do it, but they all fundamentally do the same thing, which now you're actually boiling those cannabinoids, right, at very high temperature, boiling them off and distilling them, right, just like you're
making a refinery. It's a bit,
exactly. Okay. So now you're distilling, and that allows you to get up into concentration levels of 90, 95, 98 even percent. Wow. Cannabinoid concentrations. Yeah. So, that's kind of the overall process to go from one end to the other end. Some people will stop. They won't go all the way to distillation, and they'll take their winterized oil and reintroduce terpenes. Sometimes they're cannabis-derived terpenes that come from the extraction process, which you can do great with CO2, or they'll be artificial, right, non-cannabis-based terpenes. Either way, if you take winterized oil and you put these terpenes back into it, it does two things. One, it adds flavor to the process if you lost it through the extraction or through the secondary processing, but also then it decreases the viscosity, which is favorable for vaporizing pens a lot of times.
Interesting. And I know in the in the edibles world, I know that's a lot of the trick is how do I figure out how to remove and then add back in the terpenes that I want, either cannabis-based or non-cannabis-based terpenes for flavor profiles and sort of flavor textures that you're trying to achieve from a culinary point of view.
Right. And there's two different schools of thought. Some people want their food product to taste like weed. Some people don't want their food product to taste like weed. And, the decision on whether or not you're going to introduce an oil that has a lot of terpenes in it or not can be done in the processing stages, right? For instance, if you decarboxylate prior to extraction, that's going to essentially burn off a lot of the terpenes so that your extracted oil doesn't have a lot of flavor or taste or aroma. And your chocolate can taste like chocolate instead of your chocolate tasting like wheat.
So you can get through the extraction process, you can get a very high concentrate THC or kind of from a chemical point of view, high concentrates without a whole lot of flavor.
Yeah, and that's in particular the distillation. So going all the way from extraction through distillation will produce kind of a single compound effect where you've got just THC, for instance, and very little of anything else. 98% THC, so there's not really room for anything else to be in there. That a lot of times is a great way for chefs and the culinary world to be able to utilize THC without having to affect the rest of the flavors of their food.
Yeah. So describe this equipment a little bit, right? I mean, this is not like little tabletop sets, right? Like to do this, reasonable scale. What do these things look like? What's involved in actually doing industrial level extraction process? That's
really the key point. These are industrial systems, right? They're not tabletop systems. They're not home use systems. They're not personal. We do have a tabletop extractor that we made, and we've since discontinued it. We originally made it for small collectives and things like that. Beyond that tabletop unit, these are industrial pieces of equipment. They use 230 volt three-phase power. They're fairly large. They require heavy industrial movers and equipment movers, things like that. But basically, the extraction platform, if you're familiar at all with an air conditioner, basically the extraction system works like an air conditioner. Right. And it sounds like a strange corollary, but air conditioners have, they use Freon to essentially decompress and create this cooling effect that then you run a fan past the heat exchanger. It's got the cooling in it. That's what cools your house. CO2 does exactly the same thing. Right. What we do is we'll take liquid CO2 or sometimes supercritical CO2. The difference between them is just the solvency power. But CO2 has the ability to change the solvency power through pressures and temperatures. Nonetheless, whether it's liquid or supercritical, the same thing happens. You take this liquid CO2, you you push it through the plant material, it dissolves the oil out of the plant material. Carry that over into a secondary vessel where you decompress that CO2. That turns the CO2 from a liquid into a gas. When it does that, it loses its ability to hold that oil that it extracted out. So it separates. Once you've done that, then you take that gaseous CO2, you recompress it, and then you recirculate. And that's what a lot of people refer to as a closed loop extraction system, meaning that you take the CO2 or butane or propane or ethanol or whatever. But for the CO2 case, you take CO2 and then you recompress it and reuse it, and it just sits there and flows in a circle the same exact way an air conditioner does.
Got it. It's kind of like the CO2 is like a sponge. It goes into the plant material, absorbs the oil. You take it over to the compressing side or decompressing side. It loses its absorbing ability. It's like squeezing out the sponge, and then you send it back over, and you just cycle through.
That's a great analogy. Yeah, that's exactly what's going on. The biggest difference is, unfortunately, when you have phase changes in these gases, you get cooling and heating. Right? Air conditioners do it on purpose. They want that cooling and heating. We don't want it. Right? And so we actually have thermal management mechanisms to offset the heating and cooling.
Got it.
So that they're byproducts of the process.
So you've got to be able to handle or remove the heat that's generated on the compression side, so that you can, so that you're regulating the temperatures. So it's basically a loop system for transporting the oils between the plant material and your collection device, and then sort of the meta system of maintaining the thermal kind of condition or thermal stability of everything.
Yep. Okay. Exactly. So there's actually two closed loops. One's the CO2 doing its thing that you just described. The other is the thermal management system, which is a water regulation system where we port the heat from compression and use it to offset the heat of the cooling that happens on decompression.
Got it.
Right. If you didn't do that, you would create a bunch of dry ice. Right? That's exactly how they make dry ice, essentially. And we don't want the dry ice. We don't want the
secondary business on the side.
Right. Exactly. We don't want dry ice. We want gas. And so we actually have to heat it up a little bit to prevent it from turning into dry ice.
Yeah. So in terms of, if I'm running one of these industrial systems, what does my cycle time on this look like? Am I doing like an extraction every 10 minutes? Does it take me 6 hours? Like, what does the actual production process look like for someone who's operating one of these?
So our newest system called the Duplex, it processes about 8 pounds per hour. And so you can do about 170
of raw material. You can put
a raw plant material.
So 8 pounds of raw plant material you can process in that time frame. Okay.
Per hour, right? So you can do about 175 pounds a day. The vessel sizes are going to vary. There's some different models and series and stuff, but generally you can process about 175 pounds per day of raw plant material. The next question then is how much do I get out of that 175 pounds, right? And yields are going to be heavily dependent on the plant material, the quality of the plant material you're putting in. So it's the age-old shit in, shit out, right? So in this scenario, if we take our 10 to 15% trim, for instance, we'll conveniently get about a 12, maybe 15% yield on that trim.
Okay. So we're going to get about a pound for an 8 pound input. You're going to get about a pound of oil coming out
crude.
Of the other end.
Yeah, crude is a better way to say it, right?
And that's at, you said about 35, 40%?
It'll be higher. It'll be 40, maybe 50%.
50% concentrate. Okay. And then I can further refine it from there if I want to focus on this.
Realize every time you refine it, you lose weight.
Yeah, I'm removing the non-active ingredients in this. So I'm decreasing the volume, but increasing the concentration. Okay, so that's excellent because I think that gives me actually a much better sense of the actual sort of distillation process. You just mentioned briefly, so you said, this is all based on CO2. Your technology is focused on CO2. You mentioned that there's some other ones. What are sort of the pros and cons, or why do these other ones exist? Is it more kind of, it was easier to do, the technology was easier then? Is this CO2 is the more advanced? I mean, how do these methods compare?
Yeah, I like to start this conversation with kind of a disclaimer. One, I'm obviously biased towards CO2, right? So that's what we make, that's what we do. That being said, I try to really heavily emphasize with people that there isn't one extraction technology that's better than the other, right? There's pros and cons, right? There's a reason to use one and they all depend ultimately on what you're trying to do at the end of the product stage. So if you look at CO2, its pros, the biggest advantage is the fact that we talked about before, it's tunable. You can change its solvency characteristics over the course of pressures and temperature changes that allow you to be selective. So we talked about extracting terpenes, for instance, set low temperature, low pressure extraction parameters, and you gain very, very liquid, extremely extremely fragrant and aromatic terpenes, right? Increase the temperature and pressure, and you start to get into more cannabinoid extraction.
Got it.
Kind of lower end, higher end. So you have this tunable capability of CO2 extraction. The other benefit of CO2 is the fact that it wants to be a gas at room temperature and pressure. So residual solvents are never a problem. Think about a gas. Think about a beer or a soda.
Yeah.
They go flat.
Yeah.
Same thing happens with the extracted oils, all the CO2 outgases. So you never have any residual gas or residual solvents.
Yeah.
The biggest con to CO2 is in order to get it to be a liquid or a supercritical fluid, you have to operate at pressures of 1,000 or 5,000 psi. So the equipment becomes very expensive as a result.
Yeah.
Compare and contrast with butane and propane, right? Another solvent-based mechanism that's popular in the cannabis industry. Butane and propane has the pro is that it's very fast. It's a strong solvent. It works quickly. It's relatively inexpensive because it operates at low pressure, so the equipment can be significantly cheaper and creates some very unique products, shatters and honeycombs, crumbles, the dabbing products. It does a really good job at making those. The first obvious drawback is explosivity, right? And so while the equipment itself is relatively
it's just a minor drawback.
It's pros and cons, right? So we're not. It is a big drawback. It really is. And the biggest problem with it, other than the obvious issues of it being, well, let me say it this way. There's two problems that come with it being explosive. One is the costs of dealing with the explosive nature. So in order to process safely with an explosive solvent, you have to have an explosion-proof Class 1 Division 1 facility. Yeah. So now your inexpensive equipment has to go into a very expensive facility, and it starts to offset the savings that you might get. The other one is a perception, right? The perception of hydrocarbon extraction solvents is that stuff came out of the ground at one point. And so while you can refine it to a certain point, you can never get all of the heavy metals out. You can never get all of the residual solvents out. You can get it lower than detectable, but it's never all gone. Right? It's just physics demands you can never get rid of it all. Yeah. So there's perception issues in the marketplace, in particular on the medical side, and utilizing products that come from hydrocarbons. So the other big drawback for beyond the explosivity issue there is hydrocarbons. They're one and done, right? So you don't have the ability to tune the solvent the same way you do with CO2. So you lose the ability to be selective. You kind of get everything you can. Now you can try to defeat that, and a lot of people will run what's called cold extractions. They'll run at minus 40 Fahrenheit or sometimes even colder than that. And what they're really doing is just suppressing the power of the solvent, so it's not as strong. Okay. And that minimizes the amount of chlorophyll and waxes that are brought out during the extraction process. But obviously, it takes a lot more energy input in order to make that happen. So you can kind of treat it that way in order to mitigate that problem, but it's still a problem. Yeah. Compare and contrast it with ethanol, right? Ethanol extraction is becoming very popular, particularly in California here lately, since they categorized it in a more favorable category than butanes and propanes. So alcohol is all the rage right now in California in particular. Ethanol is just 200 proof alcohol. It's got very similar qualities to butane and propane without the explosivity. So it's a very, very powerful solvent. Yep. FDA, generally regarded as safe, approved by the FDA, utilized in lots of food and flavoring extraction applications throughout the country besides cannabis. The biggest problem with ethanol is the fact that, much like butane and propane, it's one and done, right? And you've got no real capability to tune it other than treating it much like butane and propane, making it cold. Yep. So you suppress its capability, suppress its power essentially, and you get out less chlorophyll, less waxes, fats, but you also lost your tunability. Yep. Getting terpenes out of a butane and propane system, or getting separating terpenes, let me say it that way, separating terpenes as an isolated fraction is nearly impossible with butane and propane or ethanol extractions. CO2 really shines in that area, but ethanol is 10 times probably faster, especially warm ethanol. Is 10 times faster than either butane and propane or CO2. So, if your end goal is distillation, starting with ethanol makes a ton of sense, because ethanol makes a lower quality extract, but through filtering and then ultimately the distillation process, you can have a very high quality distillate, even though you started with a low quality extract, right? So which one you choose really makes more sense on what is your end goal, distillate versus shatter versus honeycomb versus winterized oils that are great for vape pens with flavor. They're there. What we see, the trend among our larger processing customers is they've got at least two, if not all three. Yeah, just because of the trade-offs and the nature of it all depends on what your outcome is going to be. You may want to have multiple extracting capabilities to create your products. Yeah, exactly. And if you want to diversify your product line, you really need to have all three technologies available in order to produce the different product types that the dispensaries are demanding. Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about your business, because I think I see sort of the market, or I see this whole kind
kind of distillation sort of segment of the market and, possible different ways of approaching it. You're looking at it from, it sounds like you're doubling down on the CO2 technology. Where are you looking to play? Where are you looking to expand? How are you approaching this from a business point of view? Where do you see your opportunities?
Well, so CO2 has really never had an opportunity to find itself into what I call a mid-market application. Okay. Prior to 2012 or 2010, or within the last 10 years, CO2 has only found its way into the smaller scale laboratory, university type applications, and a few very large scale applications for coffee or tea decaffeination, hops extraction. There's a few very large plants, but generally the mid-range just didn't have any place to play. CO2 hadn't found its way in there because it needed a low volume, high value product in order to allow companies like ours to really have enough momentum and inertia to do research and development, innovation on the process to increase its speed and efficiency and decrease the cost, right? So along comes cannabis, right? The perfect high value, low volume product that has a need for a clean extraction method like CO2. Kind of the perfect storm. So that allowed our company to start to really do a lot of innovation, research, development on CO2 extraction systems. So here we are today, and in a situation where the extraction technology has really progressed very rapidly over the past certainly 5 years, if not the last 10 years, almost corollary to like an iPhone. Yeah. Right. Where you can have an iPhone 4 from 5 years ago or however long ago. It still works, still makes calls, still texts, but nobody uses it because it's ancient technology. Right. It's ancient technology. Yeah. The unfortunate reality is CO2 extraction systems are evolving at that same pace right now. And it's great because the technology is pacing so fast. It's terrible because customers are finding themselves 2 years after making a $50,000 or $100,000, $150,000 purchase, they've got antiquated technology. Yeah. Still works, but it's not as efficient, not as fun. So, where we're going from a business standpoint is we're continuing to focus on CO2. That is our niche, right? We've got a 17,000 square foot purpose-built manufacturing facility to do nothing but build CO2 extraction systems. We've got the manufacturing capabilities to build our own vessels, build our own control systems, build our own CO2 extractors. We only outsource 2 components at the moment, and that's our compressor as well as the chiller, which are kind of their own animals. Everything else gets made in-house. But, our focus is CO2. And, cannabis has been the growth mechanism for our company over the last 5, maybe 10 years. But it's starting to plateau, right? We're starting to see the rate at which the expansion of new states coming on is slower. Mm-hmm. And those new states come on with a smaller number of larger licenses, larger operators. Yeah. So, the opportunity for extraction platforms in the U.S. is starting to plateau, right? It's not going down, but it's just kind of leveling off. Yep. So, where does CO2 find its place in the world? Well, one is cannabis internationally, right? Yeah. So we're looking at Canada, we're looking at Europe, looking at South America, looking at, Australia. All of these places that are starting to come online and bring cannabis applications online through licensing are new opportunities for CO2, just the same way CO2 had opportunities here in the States 5-10 years ago. So that's, one growth mechanism that we intend to continue to follow. It's a little bit more challenging than doing it here in the U.S. because there's certifications that are required by these other companies. CE, for instance, in Europe. Canada requires CRN. Australia has its own set of codes. And then there's also the additional electrical voltages that are different and language barriers and things like that. But nonetheless, the international opportunity is certainly the next big thing. Beyond cannabis is kind of the next area where we're focusing as well. So looking at getting into applications for extracting, kind of where we started, flavorings, natural products, essential oils, with the push towards more natural products and fewer, harsher chemicals in these the beauty world, the makeup world, the cosmetics. There's definitely a push towards CO2 extraction as a cleaner alternative. What are some of the nasty chemical processes that are being used now, like hexane or pentane? So, that move is a little bit different in that instead of introducing CO2 into an environment like cannabis that has already been accepted, getting CO2 into an environment where we're displacing a current technology is, it's a different kind of challenge, a different marketing and sales challenge. CO2, I believe, the reason it hasn't happened before is because CO2 wasn't fast enough. It wasn't efficient enough. The evolution of the CO2 technology is now at a place where it is fast enough and it is efficient enough to start to displace some of these other nasty chemicals that are being used in essential oil applications and natural product applications. So that's the next bigger play. And that's a longer, 3 to 5 year kind of play for Apex. Yeah,
no, it's good. I think having a strategy and having a plan for how this is going to evolve, I think is a good one. I think a lot of people are in this space just kind of making hay while things are, busy and crazy and there's a lot of money flying around. But I think as the market matures, things are consolidated a little bit, like knowing what seat you want to be in as the music starts to, at least change, if not stop, is going to be a good strategy.
Like I said, alcohol is all the rage right now. And it's been real tough, for us to stay focused. You read leadership books and you go through all that kind of stuff, and they all talk about, focus on your niche, focus on what you're good at, don't get distracted. Yep. And I got to tell you, dude, there are multiple conversations where we said, should we build a butane or propane extractor? Should we be building an ethanol extractor? And, we could do those things. Yeah. But I don't think,
I'm sure you could.
But I think, there's always limited resources. Yes, exactly. And I think we would ultimately becoming a, master of none and jack of all.
Yeah.
And I don't think that's where we want to be. So we've resisted the urge. We've stayed focused on CO2 and it's been a bit of a bumpy ride here in the last couple of years as the other technologies are kind of finding their place. But nonetheless, it's still, I think, the right move.
Yeah. Well, kudos to you for having the kind of bigger picture and the foresight and the dedication to doing that. I think that's one of the things as a coach I'm constantly trying to get companies to do and leadership teams to remember is stay focused on it, because it is a longer term game and there's a lot of distractions, and half the job is just keeping your eye on the ball you want to focus on. So good. Andy, this has been great. So if people want to find out more about Apex, about you, about technologies, the products that you create, what's the best way to get a hold of you and find out more information?
Well, so you can, depends on how old you are, is what it ultimately comes down to. If we look at our leads, if you're somewhere between, 5 and probably about 30, then you're going to go straight to the internet on your phone and apexsupercritical.com, APEKS, supercritical.com. We got a whole slew of videos on there.
Awesome.
Talking about our business, talking about our dogs, talking about, a whole bunch of different stuff, maintenance on the equipment. So Apex Supercritical is a great resource. If you tend to be in the 65 to 85 range, which, we've got a number of those folks as well. The phone is typically the mechanism that they choose to use, which is 740-809-1160. Alternatively, feel free to email us. It's info@apexsupercritical.com.
Right.
If you want to email me directly, it's andyj@apexsupercritical.com.
Awesome. And I'll make sure that all that information is in the show notes so people remember it and can click on things. Andy, it was a pleasure. I'm curious to stay in touch and kind of hear how things develop. It's a fast moving market. Maybe one last question. If you were an entrepreneur getting into this space these days, if you're interested in kind of the cannabis world, where would you start? If you're going to start a new business, where do you see the opportunity, or where do you see the need that needs to get addressed?
Well, I got two things I'm going to say to that. One is find your niche. So, don't chase whatever is popular or whatever's on the news. Find your niche, find out whatever you're good about and what you're passionate about, and ultimately drive your passion into, the marketplace. Because if you're not passionate about it, when things fall, when things start to go bad, oh my God, it's terrible. So that's you have to have that passion, have to have that drive, because that's going to help you weather the storm. The other piece of it is, I'll tell you, it's a different marketplace than it was just 5 years ago. As an entrepreneur that's experienced fast growth in the cannabis space, we were lucky. We were in the right place at the right time. Nowadays, looking back on it, I think my biggest mistake is we didn't grow fast enough. That's crazy. I mean, we were the 24th fastest growing private company in the U.S. on the Inc. 500 in 2015, and I'm telling you, we didn't grow.
That wasn't fast enough.
That was not fast enough.
You should have been top 5.
Well, exactly. Yeah. Well, it's just it ultimately what happened was, because the market is growing so fast, we weren't able to position ourselves to prevent the competition, right? And so even though we were growing extremely fast, we were doing everything we could to hang on, and I resisted the urge to bring on capital, right? So I still own 100% of the company. And you know what? Looking back, I think in this marketplace with a fast-growing environment, I should have looked to bring more capital on faster, so that we could have been bigger today than what we are.
Soak up more of that new market, prevent the competition.
And take more of the market share. Exactly.
Yeah. Well, sage advice. This has been a great conversation, great insights. I'm curious to stay in touch and see how the next 12, 24 months play out for you and for the industry. And I really appreciate the time. Thanks for being on the program.
Thanks for having me on.
You've been listening to Thinking Outside the Bud with business coach Bruce Eckfeldt. To find a full list of podcast episodes, download the tools and worksheets, and access other great content, visit the website at thinkingoutsidethebud.com. And don't forget to sign up for the free newsletter at thinkingoutsidethebud.com/newsletter.